My research interests are sort of where collective organizing comes together with non-standard work. So particularly with workers who are, have some sort of state of exception around labor law, whose rights to freedom of association and collective bargaining have been limited in some way. And so for that reason, I had decided for my dissertation to focus on the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. Now, I chose this in 2011. The following summer, cab drivers were lighting cars on fire in France, right? So I chose this just as Uber was coming into the market, which has given me, I think, some interesting perspective in looking, an interest in what drivers' experiences have been also through this transition. So the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, just for sort of frame of reference, 21,000 members. There are about 130,000 plus drivers in the city across all sectors of for-hire vehicles. They self-identify as a union, though they're legally classified as a nonprofit organization, and that's because drivers are self-employed. They are the first AFL-CIO affiliate of self-employed workers, which is a pretty big deal. And it's incredibly diverse union. I don't know if anyone would recognize this picture. Anyone? It's from the ban, Trump's ban on Muslim immigrants and visitors, and the protests that started in the States started at the airports in New York City by taxi drivers, including members of New York Taxi Workers Alliance. So yeah, I'm focused on worker perspectives. Methodologically, it would be impossible for me to have sort of a comprehensive survey that would be representative of all drivers in New York. That is not my goal. I seek to contribute to the depth of understanding of the industry and also the tool strategies for workers beyond traditional trade unionism. So I want to spend the rest of my time here just answering two questions. So when it comes to digital labor platforms, why have apps like Uber and Lyft completely upended the taxi industry specifically? Like, what about that industry made it so ripe for this type of disruption? And then second, sort of what was alluded to earlier, as you kind of come together to some compromise between these rogue players and traditional taxi industries. In New York City, there was very, very recently, just in August, they instituted a vehicle cap on FHV for hire vehicles, which would include vehicles like Uber. But they also are in the process of instituting a citywide fare that will affect all FHV drivers, which is a pretty remarkable feat in New York. So I want to do that in two ways. One, I want to look very briefly at the historical context because I think that that is very informative in terms of explaining sort of why the taxi industry was targeted first. And then second, I want to look at a little bit at the role of drivers. So what does driver response to dissatisfaction, sort of drawing on this exit voice, loyalty, neglect, Hirschman framework, how might that be helpful in understanding why Uber was so appealing? So for a very brief history, I'm not going to extensively cover it. We heard already that this was sort of occurring at a time of sort of neoliberal reform. So in New York City, you're having vast investment in fire industries, financial, real estate. There is private transfer of capped medallions, and so there's this really rapid financialization that's taking place. And what neoliberalization looked like in the taxi industry was in the introduction of leasing, also called horse hiring. And what that did was really shift the risk of employment onto the shoulders of workers specifically. So they went from employee status of having an hourly wage, having all of the employment protections that are associated with, unemployment, occupational health and safety, basic coverage for things like that, to being independent contractors, where they were paying upfront for a lease, and then they would keep everything that was on the meter. So you start the day, every single day, in the red. And most importantly, this is, drivers were really resistant to this, and they were resistant to New York. The bulletin, picture of the bulletin here is from Arlington, Virginia, and the quotation is as well. I just thought it was very fitting. But when you go through the archives, these drivers were also in touch with drivers in Philadelphia, in Chicago, in Montreal, and you can find all of their bulletins back and forth that they're sharing sort of strategies and questions. How are we going to respond to this? So the last part of this quotation in particular, the company has obviously hired a smart labor lawyer because the National Labor Relations Act, which for those of you that are not familiar with American labor law, is the law that allows you to form a union, right? Excludes independent contractors from those protections. So there had been unions in New York. They were waning. I'm not going to go into the political history there, but this completely railroaded any efforts at collective organizing. So you end up with a yellow cab industry that is characterized by workplace fragmentation that has huge repercussions on associational and structural power within the labor market, long hours, health and safety concerns, no benefits, not a very desirable place to work. And one of the ways that you really see exploitation is in overcharges. So there is a limit that's set by the city on how much garages are allowed to charge a daily driver for a lease. And this is currently between $125 and $140 per day. And that's very important because drivers are low wage workers. So it looks like your taxi meter, there's a lot of money on there, but they're paying for gas, they're paying for, to clean the car, they're paying this massive lease. And so the overcharges also just add burden to that. So it's really difficult to understand how broad and pervasive an issue this is until you're there on the ground, right? Settlements, $1.6 million, $1.2 million. And these were all happening as I was starting to do my field work and sort of speak to this period right before Uber came in, right? So drivers who are constantly dealing with these issues are really, really sick of it. And this is happening at garages across the city. Right? It's not a matter of exit. I'll move from garage A to garage B. None of them are really great options. So enter Uber. Why was there sort of this explosion? Well, there are a few sort of established reasons that we often hear about. One, driver incentives. I mean, by 2015, they were promising $16 an hour, but in 2011, they were promising $90,000 a year, right? The Uber pitch, it's flexible work, you can be your own boss. There's the economic situation at the time. So if you talk to the Taxi Workers Alliance or you talk to, ITF, they'll call Uber recession pimps, Walmart on wheels, right? The number of licensed drivers around 2010, the recession was late to come to New York. The number of licensed drivers, historic precedent, has always increased at times of economic downturn. The whole medallion system was put in place shortly following the Depression because of issues of, just flooded markets, too many workers, so on and so forth. They did steamroll regulation for sure, consumer demand, right? But I think they were also very strategic in how they built consumer demand. So we can talk about that maybe in the question period if you're interested. So for lease drivers, people who were paying these massive payments every day just to be able to get a car to drive on the road, they for the first time have choice. They've never had meaningful choice before. Uber really is an exit option. Owner operators, people who have bought medallions on the other hand, are stuck with them, right? And it's having a really big impact on the ability of medallion owners to find a partner to drive with because typically they drive for 12-hour shifts. So it doesn't take long for drivers to realize that Uber is the taxi industry 2.0. A lot of the same conditions that characterized the taxi industry, people are again feeling as, as they're working for Uber. The one really huge difference is this massive oversupply of drivers. So I pulled the numbers for black cars and livery drivers. That's the subsector that Uber came into in New York City. 35,000 in 2014. Now we're at 107,000, right? This is the same transportation infrastructure, the same number of roads, so on and so forth. So the other, sorry, I just lost my place. Yeah, so what the Taxi Workers Alliance is sort of witnessing then is that this is not just an Uber phenomenon. It's not just the impact that this has had on yellow cab drivers, but it's a sector-wide issue. It's not a firm issue, it's a market issue. It also means that now you have an entire new part of the working population that is also debt-ridden. Just swamped in debt. And so as the New York Taxi Workers Alliance is sort of fielding calls late at night about what people are going to do about all of this money that they owe, even on their Uber cars, right? Because purchasing a vehicle was I'll call it a near requisite of Uber, right? Uber had set up the infrastructure to help with financing. Uber had helped drivers acquire cars, helped with getting people through the licensing requirements, helped them getting insurance, right? So they had put all of the pieces in place to help drivers take on a huge amount of debt to buy a vehicle. And so the Taxi Workers Alliance, as they're sort of hearing all of these individual stories, we decided, well, let's do a survey of drivers across all sectors to really understand how this has contributed to a race to the bottom, right, on a sort of market-wide perspective. So these are just some of the highlights from the 307 app-based drivers that we had. And what you see, again, is just a tremendous amount of debt. And we asked a lot of questions about debt specifically because we had heard sort of through interviews, through driver outreach, that debt was a real problem. So almost 30% using personal savings or personal loans for work-related expenses. People are filing for bankruptcy. A number, 73% say that Uber has or other related apps have negatively affected their ability to earn a livable income. A quarter don't anticipate that they'll be driving. Another 40% said they weren't sure if they would be driving in 5 years. But what is the most interesting one to me here is that over 80% who are driving more hours for the same amount of money or less. And that is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it's reflective in Uber's pricing policy for how they were paying drivers out at the time. And two, Uber hired an economist from Princeton. They did a survey themselves in 2015, and they found very similar findings related to drivers driving more hours and earning the same or less money. Unsurprisingly, they did not report that in their conclusions that they made. Medallion owners, on the other hand, are stuck with absolutely toxic assets. I mean, I just want to emphasize again, these are people that are making $30,000 a year and living in New York City, right? So they go from purchasing and financing medallions that are over $1 million, and those are now selling on the market for less than $200,000. So to bring it back to these concepts of exit, voice, loyalty, and neglect. So debt really restricts the range of possible responses. One might argue that you can switch from Uber to Lyft and that would be an expression of exit. But very few drivers distinguish between the apps at all, right? This is a very competitive market. The way that these apps are engineered is towards market dominance, right? So there's not you can't leave the market. Like, the ease of entry is not matched by an ease of exit. Thank you. Secondly, the concept of loyalty, right? Drivers are not loyal to a particular app. In fact, we found that almost 3/4 of them multi-home or use multiple apps simultaneously, one in order to make enough money, and then they'll just continue to drive on wherever they get the hail first. So the notion, if you have to multi-home in order to, piece together enough money for your family, you can't, you can't really exit. Neglect, certainly you see hugely. Tons of drivers in sort of qualitative interviews will express things that, as soon as I have paid my car off, I'm getting out of this. It's not what I thought it was going to be. And that was a very, very, very common sentiment until earlier this year, when it became clear that neglect was actually killing people. There have been 7 suicides thus far in New York City of drivers. And there was a very, very public incident that was preceded by a very public statement from a driver in February. And the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, who had been sort of working throughout the city, trying to have dialogue, trying to have meetings, sort of took this as an opportunity to mourn. And through that mourning was able to really unite people together, and it served as a catalyst for voice. And so their campaign transformed from something where you had sort of individual driver desperation, right, which sort of hits this kind of ultimate moment with like the tragic death of, half a dozen drivers throughout this year. And then is really becomes a motivating factor for industry-wide, throughout the market, regulatory push. So, they took a very broad-based approach. They are called the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, but they are working with drivers who are Uber drivers and who are Lyft drivers and who drive, green cabs and yellow cabs. And so they were successful in instituting a 1-year cap, as the city does sort of longer and more comprehensive studies, so perhaps some sunset kind of regulation there. And then also this notion of a sector-wide fare rate. And that is, there's a lot of discussion about exactly what that will be and how it will be determined, and that is still in process. So to end, thanks. There are a few sort of, I think, big takeaways from this. One is that I think, particularly with transportation services, you cannot discuss these types of interventions without discussing the ecosystem as a whole. It's not Uber drivers or taxi drivers. A lot of these people have crossovers, and a lot of them have driving histories that are long. And New York, in some ways, is an anomaly market. A lot more people who drive for these types of services in New York are, they're more likely to be full-time professional drivers. But any growth in one of these areas is going to impact the other. And if you look at ride data from New York City, if you look at the number of trips in New York City, you can see the impact that these services are having on the traditional taxi market. Related to that, a critique, thank you, of Uber is should not be equated with endorsement of the taxi industry, right? That was a problem. People didn't like that. There was a lot of exploitation. That is, the Uber can't work without drivers. It's sort of having this mea culpa tour right now to try to sort of recast its image. But the goal is not to go back. It's to find sort of a better way forward. And so the last sort of takeaway, I think, is just the continued need for some sort of voice and dialogue that does incorporate, all workers, regardless of what their employment status is, because they are still subject to regulation in a way that really directly impacts their, daily experience of work. So thanks.